The American suburbs are built on the promise of safety, a place where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. But in the 1990s, that illusion was shattered for 10 families. Today, we're covering the 10 most disturbing missing children cases from the 90s that were finally solved. These stories cross the line from terrifying mysteries to unthinkable truths. Before we start, I have a quick announcement. If you are enjoying my videos and want to support the channel, you can now become a member. Now, lock your doors and let's get into it. Picture this, it's a Monday morning, first period. A 6-year-old kid is sitting cross-legged on a classroom carpet in rural Oklahoma, probably worrying about nothing bigger than whether he'll get the good crayons at art time. 20 minutes later, he's gone. Not wandered off, not missed the bus. Gone. Snatched out of his first-grade classroom by a man who walked in through the front doors of the school like he owned the place. And here's the part that will keep you up tonight. The man who took him wasn't his father. He wasn't even who he said he was. In fact, almost nothing about this little boy's life was what it appeared to be. Not his last name, not his mother's name, not even the story of where he came from. This is the case of Michael Anthony Hughes, Choctaw, Oklahoma, September 12, 1994. If you've never been there, imagine one of those flat, sun-bleached suburbs east of Oklahoma City where the biggest event of the week is a high school football game. Wide streets, pickup trucks, a church on every other corner. The kind of place where parents genuinely believe, and honestly, they had every reason to, that nothing bad happens here. That morning, the atmosphere at Indian Meridian Elementary School was, well, boring. And I mean that as a compliment. The hallways smelled like floor wax and cafeteria pancakes. First graders were shrugging off backpacks that were almost as big as they were. Teachers were sipping lukewarm coffee. Somewhere, a copy machine was jamming. Total, boring, beautiful safety. And in one of those first-grade classrooms sat Michael Anthony Hughes. 6 years old, blue t-shirt with red sleeves, little red and blue shorts, black high-top sneakers, a red and blue Aladdin backpack slung by the door. He was, by every account, a happy kid, which is remarkable when you learn what he'd already lived through, but we'll get to that. Now, Michael was in the process of being formally adopted by his foster parents. They loved him. He was thriving, talking, laughing, running around, doing all the things a 6-year-old should do. For the first time in his short life, he was somewhere stable. And then, at some point that morning, the front doors of Indian Meridian Elementary swung open, and a man walked in. His name, or the name he was going by, was Clarence Hughes. He was calm, confident. He walked past the office windows like he had every right to be there. And in a way, in the twisted paperwork of the world, he did. This was a man the courts had been dealing with for years. A man who had, at various points, claimed to be Michael's father. A man who had lost that claim in court. And a man who was, right at that moment, tucking a gun into his waistband. He walked straight into the principal's office. Principal James Davis looked up, probably expecting a parent question about a lunch account. Instead, he got a pistol pointed at his chest. What happened next is the kind of thing you don't forget. Floyd, because that was his real name, but nobody at the school knew that yet, forced the principal out of his own office, marched him through the halls of an elementary school full of children, and made him drive out to a wooded area near the school. There, he handcuffed Davis to a tree, taped his mouth shut, and left him there. Just left him. Then he went back for the kid. Now, think about the sheer cold nerve of that. He didn't grab Michael first. He neutralized the principal first, then walked back into the school building, back into the first-grade wing, back into a room full of 6-year-olds, and calmly collected the boy. No struggle, no screaming teacher tackling him, because to the school, he was still just Clarence Hughes, the man who used to have visitation. He put Michael in a stolen 1994 Ford pickup and drove away. By the time Principal Davis worked himself free, hours later, after struggling against those handcuffs, dehydrated, terrified, the school was already in lockdown. Police were everywhere. The FBI was on its way. And the manhunt for a 6-year-old boy in a blue and red t-shirt was already spilling out across state lines. At this point, the working theory was simple. Ugly, but simple. This was a custody dispute, a bitter stepdad who couldn't handle losing his kid to the courts. Extreme? Absolutely. But investigators had seen it before. Guy loses custody, guy snaps, guy grabs the kid and runs. So the FBI did what you'd expect. They tried to contact the mother, get her on the phone, get her to talk him down, figure out what he wanted. And that's where the whole story cracks open. Because they couldn't call the mother. Tanya Hughes, Michael's mom, was dead. She'd been killed in 1990, a hit and run in Oklahoma City, struck on the side of a road late at night under circumstances that nobody had ever really been able to explain. She was gone. Michael had been in foster care ever since. Now, hold on a second. Let's look at that again. If Tanya Hughes had been dead for 4 years, why was the FBI still calling this a custody dispute? How do you have a custody dispute with a woman who's been in the ground since '90? What was Floyd really doing here? What did he actually want with this specific 6-year-old kid? That question, that single question, is what unraveled everything. Investigators started pulling on the thread, and the more they pulled, the weirder it got. They tried to look Tanya Hughes up. Birth records, school records, a driver's license from before she moved to Oklahoma, a childhood photograph, anything. There was nothing. Tanya Hughes, the woman on the death certificate, didn't exist before the mid-1980s. She had no past, no relatives calling to grieve her, no high school yearbook, nothing. It was as if she had walked out of a fog fully formed as an adult. It's not how people work. People have paper trails. People have mothers who show up at their funerals. So the FBI ran her fingerprints against every missing persons file they had. And they got a hit. Tanya Hughes wasn't Tanya Hughes. She was a woman named Suzanne Marie Savakis, and she had been reported missing decades earlier, as a child. She disappeared in the 1970s when she was just a little girl, along with her mother. Except her mother had made it back home eventually. Suzanne never did. The man who had taken Suzanne? Same man now sitting in a stolen pickup with 6-year-old Michael. Franklin Delano Floyd. Let me say this out loud so it lands, because it took me a minute the first time I heard it too. Franklin Delano Floyd had kidnapped a little girl in the 1970s. He'd raised her under a rotating string of fake names, new town, new alias, new father-daughter backstory every few years. He subjected her to unimaginable trauma for her entire childhood. And when she became a young adult, he married her, his own kidnap victim. The girl he'd raised as his daughter, he legally married under a fake name, and she ultimately had his child. That baby was Michael. So the whole time Floyd was in Oklahoma family court, arguing about visitation rights, paying child support from a prison cell, insisting he was Michael's stepdad. He was actually the boy's biological father, or something even more monstrous than that. Michael was the son of Floyd's kidnap victim. He was the second generation of a horror story that had started 20 years earlier. And here's the thing that turns your stomach. When Suzanne started to figure it out, when the fog started lifting on the life he had trapped her in, she died in a hit and run on a dark road. Nobody ever arrested anyone for it. You do the math. So the FBI wasn't chasing a stepdad in a custody meltdown. They were chasing a serial predator who had spent his entire adult life stealing children, rewriting their identities, and destroying anyone who tried to expose him. And now he had another 6-year-old in a truck heading who knows where. 2 months went by. 2 months of tips, sightings, dead ends. And then, in November 1994, Floyd was picked up in Louisville, Kentucky. He was alone. The truck was empty. No Michael, no backpack, no blue and red t-shirt, just Floyd, silent. He wouldn't say a word about the boy, not a single word, for 20 years. Think about that. 20 years. 2 decades. The kid's foster parents grieving without a body. Investigators dying, retiring, handing the case off to younger agents who inherited a file and no answers. Missing child posters going yellow on the walls of gas stations. Age progression sketches showing what Michael might look like at 8, then 12, then 16, then a full-grown man. All while Floyd sat in a cell, connected on other charges, including the murder of a young woman named Cheryl Ann Comesso, a disturbing photograph of whom investigators had actually found taped to the gas tank of the truck Floyd abandoned near the school on the day of the kidnapping. Yeah, that was there the whole time. He was on death row in Florida. He was going to die in that cell one way or another, and he still would not say what he had done with Michael. Some people held on to hope. Maybe Floyd had handed the boy off to someone. Maybe Michael was out there somewhere, in another state, being raised under yet another new name. It had happened before. It had literally happened to Michael's own mother. Why not to him? But that theory doesn't survive contact with who Floyd actually was, because Floyd didn't hand kids off. Floyd used kids, and when kids stopped being useful, when they cried, when they got scared, when they made noise, Floyd got rid of them. It took until 2014. FBI Special Agent Scott Lobb, working out of the Oklahoma City division, sat down with Floyd one more time. Nobody expected much. Cold case interviews with dying men on death row usually go nowhere. But this time, Floyd talked. He said that on the same day he took Michael from the school, the same day, he drove the boy toward the Texas border. Somewhere along the way, Michael did what any 6-year-old ripped out of his classroom by an armed stranger would do. He started crying. He couldn't stop crying. Floyd, sitting there with a stolen truck and a nationwide manhunt closing in on him, decided the kid was, in his words, out of control. He pulled off Interstate 35. He walked Michael into a wooded area, and that is where he tragically took the young boy's life. That's how he described it. He didn't remember exactly where. He gave the FBI a rough area near the last exit before Texas. Agents brought in the evidence response team. University of Oklahoma anthropologists came out. They dug through a 2,000-square-foot patch of ground looking for anything. A bone, a shoe, that little Aladdin backpack. They found nothing. 20 years of Oklahoma weather, 20 years of animals, 20 years of dirt. Whatever had been there was gone. So that's where it ends. Not with a body, not with a grave, not even with a place his foster parents can visit. Michael Anthony Hughes was 6 years old. He had just started to talk, to run, to laugh like a normal kid after a childhood that had been anything but normal. He had a family that was in the middle of legally making him theirs forever. He walked into his first-grade classroom on a boring Monday in September and never walked out. Franklin Delano Floyd died of natural causes on Florida's death row in January 2023. 79 years old. He took the last details with him, the exact spot, the exact moment, whatever Michael's last words were, all of it, gone with him into the ground. And the thing that stays with you, the thing you can't shake once you know this story, is that Michael's whole short life was written by the same man. His mother's stolen childhood, his mother's death, his own kidnapping, his own murder. One monster, one family, hollowed out from the inside. He was taken from a safe classroom in a safe town by a man who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, and he never came home. The tape was less than 30 seconds long. A little girl's voice, panicked, saying she'd been grabbed by a man with a knife. It was supposedly recorded from a payphone inside a packed video arcade, the loudest place on Long Island on a December afternoon. Kids screaming, machines beeping, holiday music blasting. But when detectives sat down and pressed play on that tape, they heard something impossible. Silence. Not muffled crowd noise, not distant chatter. Absolute, dead, recording studio silence. A little girl calling for help from an arcade that sounded like a tomb. And that's when investigators realized this wasn't a kidnapping that had just happened. This was a kidnapping that had been rehearsed. This is the case of Katie Beers, Long Island, New York, December 28, 1992. The days between Christmas and New Year's have a specific kind of feeling to them. The tree is still up, but the magic is gone. The wrapping paper's in the trash. It's gray outside, cold in a way that gets into your bones. Everyone's tired. On Long Island that particular week, the wind coming off the Atlantic had teeth. It was that dead, in-between stretch of the year where nothing feels quite real. And in Bayshore, a 9-year-old girl named Katie Beers was 2 days away from turning 10. Now, before we get to what happened that afternoon, I need to tell you about Katie's life. Because if you don't understand what she was walking away from, you won't understand why this case is so different from every other kidnapping story you've heard. Katie's home was, by every account, a nightmare. Her mother was rarely around. The house she sometimes lived in was filthy. Neighbors described roaches, garbage, junked cars on the lawn, no heat, no reliable food. Katie was a small, thin kid, often seen wandering the neighborhood without a coat in the middle of winter, running errands for adults twice her age. She didn't have a father figure. She didn't really have a mother figure either. What she had was a godmother named Linda Inghilleri, who took her in some of the time. And Linda's husband, Salvatore Inghilleri, was inflicting horrific abuse on her. I'm telling you this because you have to understand the setup here. Katie was 9 years old. She was starved for affection, starved for stability, starved for one adult in her life who would just be kind to her without wanting something in return. That was the profile of the kid we're talking about. And that is exactly the kid a predator looks for. And a predator had found her years ago. His name was John Esposito. He was a family friend, a contractor, a neighborhood guy. He'd been circling the family for a long time, buying Katie little gifts, giving her rides, offering her the kind of casual, uncomplicated attention that no other adult in her orbit ever bothered to give. To the adults around her, he was Uncle John, harmless, generous, a rare positive presence in a chaotic kid's life. On December 28, 1992, he offered to take Katie out for her upcoming birthday. Presents, fun, a trip to Spaceplex, a huge family arcade in Nesconset, about a half-hour away. The kind of place that on a school holiday afternoon would be jammed wall-to-wall with kids on winter break. Katie went. Of course she went. What 9-year-old wouldn't? Later that afternoon, Suffolk County Police received a frantic report. John Esposito was calling in a panic. He'd taken Katie to Spaceplex. He'd let her wander off to play some games. He'd looked away for a minute. When he looked back, she was gone. He'd searched the arcade. He'd searched the parking lot. And there was a message. She'd apparently called from a payphone, a message on his answering machine, saying a man had grabbed her and had a knife. That was it. 9-year-old girl, missing from a crowded arcade 2 days before her 10th birthday, in the freezing cold. The response was massive and immediate. Long Island erupted. Volunteers went door to door. Police divers went into ponds. Helicopters went up. National news trucks showed up outside the Beers house. Everyone was looking for Katie Beers, and investigators, at first, leaned exactly where you'd expect them to lean. They looked at the family. Because, and I want to be really careful here, when a 9-year-old girl vanishes from a broken, neglectful, abusive home, the first horrible theory is that someone in the family finally did something. Sold her, traded her, killed her, and staged the arcade story. Or, alternatively, that she'd finally had enough and had run away herself. On foot, in December, in New York. That last theory, honestly, never held up. Because let's look at the logic gap. Why would a 9-year-old run away in the freezing cold 2 days before her birthday from the one adult who was actually about to buy her presents? That doesn't scan. Kids running from bad homes run towards something better, a friend's house, a relative, a warm place. They don't wander into the December wind on Long Island alone. So the runaway theory started dying pretty fast, which shifted the focus. Back to Uncle John. Now, here's the thing that made investigators sick. Esposito wasn't hiding. He wasn't ducking cameras. He was actively participating in the search. He gave interviews. He shed tears on the news. He offered a reward. He held vigils. If you'd seen him on TV that first week, you would have said, "This is a good man losing his mind because he lost his best friend's kid." But cops are cops, and cops start looking. The first crack was that answering machine tape. Investigators listened to it over and over, and they kept coming back to the same problem, the audio. Katie's terrified voice saying she'd been grabbed at Spaceplex, made from a payphone inside Spaceplex. And behind that voice? Nothing. Dead air, no arcade, no music, no kids, nothing. Now, think about that for a second. Have you ever tried to make a phone call in a Chuck E. Cheese? You can barely hear yourself. There is no version of reality where you record a phone call inside a packed arcade on winter break and get zero background noise. Which means the call wasn't made from the arcade. Which means it was recorded somewhere else, somewhere quiet, somewhere controlled, and played back to make it sound live. Which means Katie was already gone before Esposito ever walked into Spaceplex. And then the eyewitnesses started coming in. Multiple people at Spaceplex remembered Esposito that afternoon, but they remembered him alone. No little girl with him, no 9-year-old in tow. He'd walked into the arcade by himself. So where was Katie during all of this? The second crack was Esposito's history. Investigators pulled his background and found something they should have found the second his name got called in. In 1977, John Esposito had pleaded guilty to the attempted abduction of a 7-year-old boy. In 1988, he'd tried to sign up for Big Brothers/Big Sisters and been rejected. He then started posting handmade flyers on supermarket bulletin boards, offering to mentor young kids in the neighborhood. This was a man with a paper trail of predatory behavior aimed at children stretching back 15 years, and he was Katie's Uncle John. Police put him under 24-hour surveillance. They interrogated him in shifts. They set up officers inside his house, watching him around the clock, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to lead them to a body. Days went by, then a week, then 2 weeks. Katie's 10th birthday came and went. There was no cake. Nobody knew if she was even alive to have one, and here's the part that will haunt you for the rest of this story. All that time, while police were sitting in Esposito's living room, drinking his coffee, monitoring his phone, Katie was maybe 15 feet away from them, right underneath their shoes. It took 17 days for Esposito to crack. 17 days of surveillance, 17 days of interrogation, 17 days of hearing the audio problem with his tape thrown back in his face, 17 days of watching himself on the news being described more and more as a suspect and less as a family friend. On January 13th, 1993, he broke. He asked for his lawyer, and then he told them. She was in the house, not somewhere in the house, in it, below it. Esposito walked detectives into his office. He rolled back a section of carpet. He pushed aside a heavy bookcase. He revealed a trap door, a solid concrete slab weighing roughly 200 pounds, set flush into the floor. It could only be opened with a mechanical block and tackle rig he had installed himself. He hooked it up. He hoisted it open, and underneath was a hole in the earth with a ladder going down about 7 feet. At the bottom was a bunker, 6 feet by 7 feet, concrete walls, concrete floor, soundproofed, a tiny coffin-sized space inside a larger fortified underground room. And held captive in that terrible space was Katie Beers. She had been held captive in that dark space for over 2 weeks, unable to move freely. And in one of the most nauseating details of the entire case, Esposito had installed a small closed-circuit TV monitor in the bunker. It fed a camera from the house above, so Katie could watch, in real time, as police officers walked through Esposito's living room searching for her. She could see them. She could hear them, faintly, through the concrete. She screamed. She screamed for hours. Nobody heard her, because he had built the room specifically so nobody would. He had started building this bunker 18 months before he took her. 18 months. He had displaced enough dirt from under his own house to fill dumpsters. And months before the abduction, when Katie visited the property, he had actually let her play in the pile of excavated dirt in the yard, laughing. He had been building her cage in front of her. Katie came out of that hole into the winter daylight on January 13th, 1993. She was 10 years old. She had survived 17 days held captive in the dark. And here is the part of this story that I still don't know how to sit with. When Katie was old enough to speak about it publicly, she said the kidnapping was, in her words, the best thing that ever happened to her. Because after the rescue, she wasn't sent back to her mother. She wasn't sent back to her godmother's husband. She was placed in a stable foster home in East Hampton with a family that loved her. She went to school. She got therapy. She grew up in a house where nobody hurt her. She went to college. She earned a degree. She got married. She had children of her own, children who will never know what she knew at 9 years old. The bunker, in the coldest, most horrible math, ended a worse nightmare than the one it started. John Esposito died in prison in 2013. Salvatore Ingaleri, the godmother's husband, died in prison in 2009. Both men were caged the same way she had been caged, and neither of them ever came out. And Katie wrote a book about all of it. She called it Buried Memories. Because if there's one thing you take away from this whole story, let it be this. They put her underground and tried to keep her there. She dug herself out, walked into the light, and picked up the pen. She got the last word. She always was going to. 2.5 blocks. That's the entire distance we're talking about. From a school bus stop to a front porch, on a working-class suburban street where every neighbor knew every kid. In the middle of the afternoon, a 9-year-old girl in a puffy winter coat stepped off the bus, started walking home, and never got there. No screams, no witnesses, no skid marks, no dropped mittens. Just 2.5 blocks of empty sidewalk and a mother waiting at a window that would never see her daughter walk up the path again. What happened in that stretch of concrete stayed a black hole for 26 years. And when the answer finally came, it didn't come from a detective or a witness or a confession. It came from a lab. This is the case of Angie Hausman, St. Anne, Missouri, November 18th, 1993. If you've never been to a suburb of St. Louis in mid-November, let me set the vibe. Cold that has an edge on it, gray sky, bare trees, front lawns going yellow, everybody's Christmas lights already going up on some houses, not yet on others. That specific late autumn feeling where the year is dying and everyone is bracing for the winter to really start. St. Anne in 1993 was working-class America. Small ranch houses, chain-link fences, duplexes, old sedans and driveways. The kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes without helmets, where you knew which house had the best Halloween candy, where the woman 2 doors down would yell at your son for cutting through her yard. Community, in the tightest sense of the word. Everybody's business, everybody's kids. And on that particular Thursday afternoon, on a specific street corner where the yellow school bus dropped off the neighborhood children every day, there was supposed to be an adult standing watch. There was a woman on that street, I want you to hear this, who made a habit of being at the corner when the bus arrived. Not a hired guard, not a police officer, just a neighbor who watched the kids get off the bus and get where they were supposed to go. That's the kind of place this was. That's the kind of casual communal safety net American suburbs used to have. Except on November 18th, 1993, that woman wasn't there. There was no reason for anyone to notice. She wasn't required. She wasn't scheduled. She was just a neighbor who happened to normally be present, who happened to not be present that afternoon. In every other version of this day, in every other week that year, she would have been at that corner. On this specific Thursday, she wasn't. That is the size of the window that a predator needs. Angie Hausman was 9 years old, 4th grade, Booter Elementary. She got off the bus that afternoon, bundled up against the cold, and turned toward home. 2.5 blocks. She had walked this route every school day of her life. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. The happy-go-lucky little girl, her neighbors would say later, using almost identical words in almost every interview. She didn't make it home. Her mother, waiting at the house, started to worry. 4 o'clock, 4:15. Kids run late. Kids get sidetracked at a friend's yard. 4:30. That's when the panic sets in. That's the temperature drop I talked about in another one of these episodes. The specific cold that hits a parent when a child is later than they should be. By 7 that evening, the police were called, and the manhunt began. Now, I need you to understand what a manhunt in 1993 St. Louis looked like. This wasn't a scroll on your phone. This wasn't an Amber Alert popping up on every screen in the metro area. There was no social media. There was no way to broadcast a face into a million pockets in 15 minutes. What there was people, flyers, church basements coordinating volunteers, neighbors combing every backyard and creek bed and abandoned garage in a 5-mile radius. The major case squad of Greater St. Louis got activated. Hundreds of officers, search dogs, helicopters, every trash can, every dumpster, every wooded lot in the region turned inside out. And they got nothing. Not a witness who saw a car, not a witness who heard a shout, not a scrap of a torn coat, not a footprint in the frozen grass. Nothing. Which raises the first terrifying question of this case. and it's the one that made investigators start losing sleep almost immediately. How does that even happen? Let's stop and think about this the way the police did. 2.5 blocks, broad daylight, well, late afternoon winter light, but daylight, a residential street, houses on both sides, people home from work, TVs on, kitchen windows facing the sidewalk, a 9-year-old girl. And she goes from the bus stop to nothing in what has to be a window of less than 3 minutes. There are only a handful of ways that math works. Option 1, somebody grabbed her without any struggle at all, which means no scream, which means either she was silenced instantly, a hand over the mouth, a threat, or she went with someone she didn't fight, which brings us to option 2. Option 2, somebody she trusted or somebody presenting a false sense of authority got her into a vehicle. A voice from a car window, an adult saying her mother had asked them to pick her up, a grown-up in a uniform or something that looked like one. A 9-year-old kid raised in a friendly neighborhood is trained to be polite to adults. That training is a weapon in the wrong hands. Either way, the abductor was fast, prepared, and hunting. This wasn't a stranger who happened to see a kid. This was somebody working a plan. And they picked a street where, that day, the usual watcher wasn't at the corner. That is the single most horrifying implication of this case. Because the question that comes with it is, did the abductor know she wouldn't be there? Or did he just get luckier than any predator has a right to get? We may never know. 9 days, 9 days of searching, 9 days of the community praying, printing more flyers, showing up at more vigils, 9 days of Angie's mother not sleeping, 9 days of every parent in St. Louis walking their kids to the bus and picking them up again, refusing to let them out of sight. On day 9, hunters walking through the Bush Wildlife Area, a big, dense conservation area in St. Charles County, well outside St. Anne, found Angie. I'm going to be careful with how I tell you this next part, because Angie was a child, and she deserves that respect. What matters for this story is what the medical examiner determined. She had been left bound in the woods. She had suffered horrific abuse during her captivity, and her official cause of death was not a wound. It was not a weapon. It was hypothermia. I need you to sit with what that means. Hypothermia takes time. Hypothermia means her killer kept her alive, somewhere, for the majority of those 9 missing days. And when he finished with her, he didn't finish her. He tied her to a tree in the freezing Missouri woods and left. Her body temperature dropped until her heart stopped. According to the examiners, she had died only hours before the hunters walked past. Hours. In 9 days of searching, the difference between finding her and not finding her was hours. That fact broke St. Louis in a way it did not recover from for a generation. Investigators pulled everything they could from that scene, every piece of duct tape, every fiber, every scrap of clothing, every particle of biological trace they could find. And in one of the more remarkable pieces of 1993 police work, a crime lab tech lifted a partial fingerprint off the sticky side of one of the strips of tape, sticky sides being about the worst possible surface to pull a print from because tape traps and destroys ridges. They pulled it anyway. They preserved it. But here's the thing. This was 1993. DNA profiling as we know it now was in its infancy. The National CODIS database was barely a concept, even if a lab could pull a viable genetic profile, and the tech to do it well from degraded, weather-exposed samples wasn't there yet. There was no big searchable digital library of criminal DNA to run it against. Detectives had, in effect, a fingerprint of a ghost. They knew a specific human being had touched that tape. They just had no way in the world to find him. The other thing that scrambled the case, at least temporarily, about a month after Angie was murdered, another little girl, a 10-year-old named Cassidy Center, was abducted and killed nearby. Same age range, same city, same terror. Every instinct in every detective's body said serial killer. Every instinct said, we have one monster hunting our kids. Schools instituted buddy systems. Parents kept their kids off sidewalks. The entire investigative apparatus of the St. Louis region reorganized itself around the theory that Angie's killer and Cassidy's killer were the same man. They weren't. Different perpetrators, different men. A grim, statistically freakish coincidence. But investigators spent years chasing a phantom serial predator that didn't exist, and that misdirection ate up leads that might have narrowed in on Angie's actual killer. The case went cold. Really cold. Detectives retired, new detectives took over. The file moved from desk to desk, from decade to decade. Every year on November 18th, somebody in the St. Louis area would post Angie's 4th grade photograph again and remind the internet that a 9-year-old was still waiting on justice. 20 years passed, then 25. The public mostly moved on. Angie's family did not. 26 years after Angie died, the science caught up. In 2019, the St. Charles County Crime Lab reprocessed the biological evidence that had been sitting in careful temperature-controlled preservation since 1993. Modern DNA extraction techniques that simply did not exist when Angie was murdered, were able to pull a full, usable genetic profile out of samples that in the 1990s would have been considered too degraded to bother with. They ran the profile through CODIS. They got a hit. His name was Earl Webster Cox. He was in his 60s. And here's the thing that will make your skin crawl. Earl Cox was not out there living free. Earl Cox had been sitting in federal prison since 2003, for over 15 years at the moment of the DNA match, for his involvement in an international child exploitation network. He had, in effect, been paying for what everybody thought were his worst crimes for a decade and a half, while investigators in Missouri had no idea that the man responsible for the murder that broke their city had been in a cell the whole time. He had thought he'd gotten away with it, and in the way it must have felt inside his own head for 26 years, he had. The paired combination of the DNA and that latent print pulled off the duct tape back in 1993. The print they had refused to throw away made the case airtight. Cox was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and severe crimes against a minor. Angie's nightmare lasted 9 days. Her mother's nightmare lasted 26 years. The killer's belief that he had beaten the system lasted almost exactly as long. None of that gives back what was taken. There is no version of this case that ends well. A little girl in a puffy winter coat still didn't walk home from her bus stop. A neighbor still wasn't at the corner. 2.5 blocks still swallowed her. But somewhere in a lab in Missouri, decades after the fact, a scientist stared at a screen, watched a match come up, and quietly did what nobody in 1993 had the tools to do. She found him. Two sheriff's deputies, a quiet country road at the edge of a small California town, a little after midnight. Their headlights pick up a car nose down in a ditch, back wheels spinning in the mud. A big bearded guy is standing next to it, sweating, with an open beer. They stop. They talk to him. They run his name. And then they help him. They call a tow. They watch him drive off into the dark. Standard rural traffic call. Nothing about it registers as important, which is the problem. Because 45 minutes earlier, in a town about 20 miles away, that same man had walked out of a 12-year-old girl's bedroom with her under his arm. And she was, almost certainly, in the woods next to that ditch, alive, listening to 2 police officers help her kidnapper get his car out of the mud. This is the case of Polly Klaas. And the worst part isn't what he did to her. The worst part is how close we came to stopping him that night. Petaluma, California. October 1st, 1993. If you've never been to Petaluma, it's about an hour north of San Francisco. Farmland turned into a small, pretty town, dairy country, old Victorians, the kind of place that puts on a chili cook-off every fall and hosts a big 4th of July parade. Working class in the neighborhoods, cozy in a way that feels like the 1950s never quite left. That first weekend in October, the air was cool but not cold. Kids were still riding bikes till the streetlights came on. Front doors in a lot of these houses didn't even get locked at night. At 427 4th Street, a 12-year-old girl named Polly Klaas was having a sleepover with 2 friends, Jillian Pelham and Kate McLean, both about her age. It was a Friday. There was no school in the morning. They had sleeping bags out on the floor of Polly's bedroom, along with the very specific chaos of a preteen girl's slumber party. Makeup, a boombox, magazines, snack wrappers, giggling into pillows about whatever crush they were currently ranking. Polly's mother, Eve, was down the hall in her own bedroom, asleep with Polly's little half-sister. That's how safe this house felt. 12-year-old girls in one room, mom asleep in the next, doors partly open. A regular Friday night in a regular American town. At around 10:30, the bedroom door opened. The girls looked up expecting Eve or one of them coming back from the bathroom, or nothing at all. What they saw instead was a stranger, a big man, beard, yellow bandana, a knife in his hand. He was already inside the room by the time they registered what they were looking at. He told them immediately and calmly that he was there for money. That was the story. Don't scream. Nobody gets hurt. Just tell me where the money is, which is a story he was telling on purpose, because it made the girls compliant, because it made them believe this was a robbery, because a robbery is a thing you survive if you cooperate. So the girls cooperated. He tied Kate's hands, he tied Jillian's hands, he put pillowcases over their heads, he told them to count to 1,000, and then he picked up Polly and walked out. Just walked out. Down the hall, past the bedroom where Eve was sleeping, out the door, into the yard, into the night. Now, hold on a second. Let's stop and think about the sheer nerve of that. There is a mother asleep in the next room. 2 children on the floor whose hands are tied but whose mouths are not gagged, who could scream at any moment. There is a 5-year-old half-sister sleeping down the hall. This is a busy suburban block. There are neighbors on both sides, streetlights outside, cars going by, and a grown man is calmly walking a 12-year-old girl out the front door in complete silence. This is not somebody's first time. This is not opportunistic. This is somebody who has practiced how to move inside somebody else's house, somebody who knows exactly how much noise a knife and a soft voice will produce, and it's approximately none. The girls counted, waited, wriggled free of their bindings. They ran to Eve. Eve woke up to the sentence you never want to wake up to. There was a man. He took Polly. She called 911, and Petaluma became the center of the country. Within hours, every squad car in Sonoma County was on the street. Within a day, the FBI was in town. Within a week, this was the biggest missing child story in America. Petaluma's population was about 40,000 people. The volunteer search operation that ran out of a local warehouse eventually processed something like 4,000 civilians who came in wanting to help. Mail carriers, farmers, retirees, high school kids, people who had never met the Kloss family drove in from Oregon, from Nevada, from L.A. They walked fields. They combed creek beds. They stapled Polly's photograph to every telephone pole between San Francisco and the Oregon border. Winona Ryder, the actress, had grown up in Petaluma and had actually gone to the same middle school Polly attended. She put up a reward. She lent her platform. National talk shows led with the story every night. The composite sketch of the bearded intruder was on every screen in the state. And nothing came back. No credible sighting, no car, no prints at first, no trail leaving the yard. It was as if Polly's kidnapper had walked into the house through the walls and back out the same way. Here is where this case goes from a horror story to a case study in how the smallest logistical failures produce the biggest tragedies. Let's go back to that same night. Around midnight, so a little over an hour after Polly was taken, a homeowner on a rural stretch of road called Pythian Road, about 20 miles north of Petaluma, calls the sheriff's office. There's a strange car pulled off the road on his property, back wheels stuck deep in the mud of a ditch. He wants somebody to come check it out. 2 Sonoma County sheriff's deputies respond. They roll up on a big bearded guy standing next to a white Ford Pinto with an open beer in his hand. He tells them he pulled off the road to relieve himself and got stuck. He seems intoxicated but not aggressive. They run his ID. His name is Richard Allen Davis. He is on parole. He's got a rap sheet a mile long. But here's the piece that matters. The dispatcher checks him against active warrants and does not, in that moment, have anything on him that requires an arrest. The kidnapping in Petaluma has been called in, but the physical description of the suspect and the details of the crime have not yet been broadcast to units in Sonoma County. It's been an hour. The system is still catching up to itself, so the deputies do the thing they think they're supposed to do. They call him a tow. They help him get his car out of the mud. They watch him drive off. Nobody follows him. Nobody notes his plate as anything special. He is, at that moment, a random drunk in a ditch on a farm road. Case closed. On to the next call. And here is the part that has haunted every person who has ever read the file. 2 months later, when investigators finally figured out what happened that night, they went back to that stretch of Pythian Road. They walked the fields off the shoulder, and they found children's clothing. Polly was there, in the woods next to the ditch. She was almost certainly alive. 2 police officers stood 20 feet from a kidnapped child, ran the kidnapper's name, and helped him get his car out of the mud. I don't know how you sit with a fact like that. I don't think you're supposed to. For weeks after the abduction, the FBI's forensic team crawled through Polly's bedroom looking for anything they could use, and they eventually found something almost too small to be found. On the upper rail of Polly's wooden bunk bed, they lifted a partial palm print, invisible to the naked eye, pulled with a light source and a specialized powder using techniques that in 1993 were, honestly, brand new. A palm print, not a fingerprint. A palm print, which is exactly the kind of thing standard criminal records did not usually contain, because when police book a suspect, they roll the fingers, not usually the full hand. Except once in a while, they roll the whole hand, in what are called major case prints, which happens to a suspect after a big enough arrest. A Petaluma detective named Andy Mazzanti spent an obscene number of hours combing through old records to see if any of the men in Richard Allen Davis's file, a name that had come up as a possible suspect for other reasons by then, had ever had major case prints taken. And he found it, buried in an 8-year-old file from Stanislaus County. Davis had been arrested in the 1980s after being pulled over for a broken taillight. That routine stop had led to a bigger case, and during booking, some deputy in a quiet, forgotten process had rolled Davis's full hand. That palm print, from that traffic stop, sat in a file for 8 years, and it matched the print on Polly's bunk bed. They had him. An investigator went to see Davis, who was being held on unrelated charges, leaned in, whispered, "They found a palm print." Davis dropped his head. He knew what that meant. He asked to talk. And a few days later, he led investigators to the shallow grave alongside US 101, where Polly was buried. Richard Allen Davis was convicted and sentenced to death. He is, at the time of this writing, still on death row in California. But the bigger story of this case isn't him. It's what happened afterward. Polly's father, Mark Klaas, took his grief and did something with it that most parents would not have the strength to do. He turned the story of his daughter's murder into a fight against how the criminal justice system handled repeat violent offenders. Richard Allen Davis was not a first-time offender. He was not a mystery man who came out of nowhere. He had a rap sheet stretching back years, filled with violent crimes, and he had been paroled again and again. Mark Klaas asked the obvious question: if a man with his history had been in prison, Polly would still be alive. So why wasn't he? That anger got channeled into what became California's 3 strikes law, passed just months after the case ended. Life sentences for violent repeat offenders. It reshaped criminal sentencing across the country. Other states copied it. Whatever you think of the law now, and it has over decades become genuinely controversial, its origin story starts with a 12-year-old girl in a yellow bedroom in Petaluma. The illusion of the safe suburban town died that night. Doors got locked, alarms got installed, parents stopped assuming the house itself was a fortress. A whole generation of American parenting shifted. Some of that shift was necessary. Some of it was fear that never went away. But the image that sticks with me, the image that stays with anyone who reads this case, isn't the courtroom or the memorial or the sentencing. It's a country road in the middle of the night, a car in a ditch. 2 deputies with flashlights doing their job, being kind to a stranger, calling him a tow. Polly in the trees, listening. She was right there, and nobody knew. Imagine a mountain town so quiet you can hear the pine needles shift in the wind. A place people literally move to because nothing bad happens there. That's the town we're starting in. And on a Monday morning in June 1991, an 11-year-old girl in a pink windbreaker walked out of her front door, waved goodbye to her mom, and headed 2 blocks up the road to her school bus stop. 2 blocks. That was the entire distance, and somewhere in those 2 blocks, she disappeared off the face of the earth, not for a week, Not for a year, for 18 years. And when she finally reappeared, it wasn't because of a genius detective or a lucky tip. It was because of a cop who trusted her gut on a college campus 3 hours away. This is the case of J.C. Lee Dugard, Myers, California, June 10, 1991. If you've never been to South Lake Tahoe, let me set the vibe. This is the kind of place where the postcards don't oversell it. Tall pines, snowmelt streams, winding residential streets carved into the side of the mountain. In 1991, this was the version of America where you left your car unlocked and your front door open, because who was going to bother you up here? The Dugard family had actually moved from the Los Angeles suburbs to Myers on purpose. Terry, JC's mom, wanted her kids raised somewhere safe, somewhere the news trucks didn't show up, somewhere kids could still walk to school. And that's exactly what JC did that morning. She was 11 years old, 5th grade, bright, cheerful, still young enough to get excited about a school field trip that was coming up. She was wearing an all-pink outfit. Pink was her thing, and she had a little butterfly-shaped ring on her finger. A silly kid detail. The kind of thing you don't even notice at the time. But hold on to that ring, because it's going to come back later, and it's going to break your heart. Her stepfather, Carl, was outside their house that morning, working on something in the garage. He watched her walk up the hill, backpack on, small figure in pink getting smaller against the pine trees. Perfectly normal. Now, the walk to the bus stop was uphill. That matters, because it meant JC was moving slowly, against traffic, on a road with essentially no cover. And it meant Carl, from his driveway a couple hundred feet down the hill, had a clear line of sight to almost the whole route. He saw a car coming, a gray two-tone sedan, nothing flashy, nothing that would make you look twice on a mountain road in 1991. It drove past JC, going up the hill, and then it stopped. The car made a hard U-turn. Now, this is where it gets strange, because U-turns aren't crimes. People miss driveways. People realize they forgot something. Carl, watching from below, didn't panic yet. He just watched. The car rolled back down toward his stepdaughter. It pulled up alongside her. He could see the driver leaning across. And then JC wasn't standing anymore. Carl couldn't process what he was seeing. 1 second she was walking. The next second she was on the ground. Then, a woman he'd never seen before jumped out of the passenger side, grabbed the little girl in pink, and dragged her into the back seat of the car. The whole thing took seconds. Carl did the only thing his brain could think of. He grabbed a mountain bike, he happened to have one right there, and started pedaling, uphill, chasing a car on a bicycle. Think about that image for a second. A grown man in his driveway clothes, standing up on the pedals of a bike, chasing a sedan up a mountain road, screaming his stepdaughter's name. The car was already gone. He knew it. He kept pedaling anyway. The car crested the hill and vanished. By the time police arrived, the whole town was already mobilizing. And within hours, this wasn't just a local story. National media was on the way to Tahoe. Composite sketches of the driver and the woman went out on every news channel. Every gas station between Reno and Sacramento had a flyer. A gray Ford sedan, two-tone, a middle-aged couple, an 11-year-old girl in pink. Nothing came back. No sightings, no tips that panned out, no abandoned car in a ditch, no clothes in a dumpster. Nothing. It was as if the sedan had driven into the pines and just evaporated. Now let's stop and think about this the way the police did. When a kid disappears, who does law enforcement look at first? Family. Always family. Statistically, that's who did it. So Carl Probian, the stepdad with the wild story about the U-turn and the bike chase, became suspect number 1 within about 6 hours. And I get it. On paper, his story is insane. A gray car pulled up. A woman jumped out. They shocked my kid with something and drove off. I chased them on a bicycle. If you're a cop hearing that for the first time, your eyebrows are up in your hairline. It's a movie plot. It's the kind of story a guilty man makes up because he thinks it sounds dramatic. But here's the thing. Let's look at the logic. If Carl was covering something up, why would he invent a story with this many specific, verifiable details? A gray two-tone sedan, a middle-aged woman, a stun gun. That's not a vague alibi. That's a police composite artist's dream. A guilty man would say, "I don't know, I didn't see anything." A guilty man doesn't hand police a vehicle description that's going to be checked against every DMV record in 3 states. Beyond that, Carl passed polygraph after polygraph. He described the same details the same way every time, and the physical evidence at the scene, what little there was, backed him up. There were tire marks consistent with a car stopping and reversing. There were no signs of a staged crime. But being cleared by the polygraph didn't clear him in the court of public opinion. For years, people in Tahoe whispered about Carl. Neighbors crossed the street. His marriage to Terry, JC's mom, cracked under the weight of it and eventually broke apart entirely. He spent the rest of his life carrying suspicion he had done nothing to earn. And then there's the broader logic gap. Think about the crime itself. This was broad daylight, on a residential street, in a small town where people know each other's cars. The kidnappers used a stun gun on a child, which, in 1991, was not exactly something you could pick up at Walmart. This wasn't a snatch of opportunity by some drifter passing through. This was 2 people in a specific vehicle with specific equipment executing a specific plan. So who plans a daylight kidnapping of a random 11-year-old on a mountain in Tahoe? And how do they get away with it so cleanly that not a single witness, not a gas station clerk, not a hiker, not another driver on the way down the pass, sees anything useful? That question sat there for 18 years. Let me talk about what 18 years actually feels like. JC disappeared in June 1991. George H.W. Bush was president. There was no internet, not really. No cell phones with cameras. No Amber Alert system. That came later. When the initial leads went cold, they stayed cold. Terry, JC's mom, refused to move, refused to change the house. She left JC's bedroom untouched. She kept birthday candles on the calendar, year after year. Cake after cake, empty chair after empty chair. And here's the part that hurts the most in retrospect. There was one moment, where the whole thing could have ended early. In 2006, 15 years into JC's captivity, police in Antioch, California, a suburb hundreds of miles from Tahoe, got a call from a worried neighbor. She said the man next door had people living in tents in his backyard. Something was off. Officers went over, they walked around the property, they talked to the guy, and they left. They never fully searched the back lot. They never noticed the hidden fence line, the second yard behind the first yard, the compound within a compound. JC was in there. Her 2 young daughters were in there, and the police walked away. 3 more years passed. By 2009, JC had been gone longer than she had been alive before the kidnapping. The pink-jacketed 11-year-old from Myers was now, mathematically, a 29-year-old woman that no one had ever seen. Composite artists had aged her sketch multiple times. She was a face on a poster people barely looked at anymore. And that's when Allie Jacobs saw something weird on a college campus. August 2009, UC Berkeley. A man in his late 50s is walking around campus handing out religious flyers. His name is Philip Garrido. He's got 2 young girls with him, one about 11, one about 15. And the girls are off, pale in an unhealthy way. Quiet, not shy quiet, empty quiet. They stand still when he stops. They move when he moves. They don't smile. They don't fidget. A UC Berkeley campus police officer named Allie Jacobs is watching this, and her gut is screaming at her. Now, this is the part I always want people to sit with. Because Allie Jacobs didn't have a crime. She had a vibe. She had a bad feeling about a guy with 2 robotic-looking kids. That's it. In another city, on another day, with another officer, this whole thing gets waved through. A cop shrugs it off. Weird dude, weird kids, moves on with her shift. Allie Jacobs did not move on. She ran Philip Garrido's name, and the screen lit up. Registered sex offender, federal parolee, prior conviction for kidnapping and severe assault from the 70s. What is this guy doing walking around Berkeley with 2 silent girls? She flagged him to his parole officer. The parole officer summoned Garrido to the office in Concord the next day. And here's the thing about Garrido. He was cocky. He'd been living under the nose of the California parole system for years. He'd been visited by law enforcement 3 years earlier and had gotten away with it. He thought he was untouchable. So when the parole office called, he didn't run. He walked right in. He brought his wife, Nancy. He brought the 2 young girls, and he brought a third woman, an adult, who he introduced as Alyssa. Investigators separated them. They asked Alyssa who she really was. She dodged, she hedged. She'd been trained for the better part of 2 decades in what she was and was not allowed to say. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the fact that her captor wasn't in the room. Maybe it was 18 years of pressure finally cracking. She said the words out loud. "My name is J.C. Lee Dugard." That was it. That was how it ended. Not with a manhunt, not with a DNA hit, not with a task force kicking down a door, with a woman in a parole office in her late 20s saying her own name for the first time since she was 11. The backyard compound came out in the days that followed. Tents, sheds, a soundproofed structure Garrido had built to hide her, 2 daughters he had fathered with her, an entire hidden family, invisible from the street, invisible from Google Earth, invisible from the police officers who had literally walked the property in 2006. And that butterfly ring? The little pink outfit ring that JC was wearing the day she got off the sidewalk in Myers? She still had it. She had hidden it from her captors for 18 years. A tiny piece of the 11-year-old girl she was before the U-turn, preserved through everything, waiting. The thing that haunts me about this case isn't the monster. Monsters, unfortunately, are almost predictable. The thing that haunts me is how close this came to going the other way. If Allie Jacobs shrugs off her gut feeling that afternoon at Berkeley, JC stays in that backyard. Nancy and Philip go home to Antioch. The daughters grow up in tents, and Terry Dugard dies not knowing. An 11-year-old walked 2 blocks up a mountain road in a pink windbreaker. It took 18 years, 1 hidden ring, and 1 campus cop with a bad feeling to bring her back. She came home, but she should never have had to. The bicycle told us almost everything we needed to know about the person who took her, not because it was broken, not because it was smashed on the side of the road, but because it wasn't. It was carefully dragged off the shoulder, walked down a steep embankment, and pushed deep into the brush where no passing car would ever spot it. A little pink bike, hidden like something buried on purpose. Which means whoever did this, whoever pulled a 12-year-old girl off a country road on a warm August afternoon, didn't panic, didn't speed off, didn't leave in a hurry. He had the time, the calm, and the intention to walk her bicycle down a hill before he drove away. That single detail should ruin your afternoon, because it means from the very first hour the police already knew what they were dealing with. This is the case of Sarah Ann Wood, the Mohawk Valley of upstate New York. August 18th, 1993. If you've never been to this part of the country, picture the postcard version of rural America. Rolling farmland, dairy country, old white churches with tall steeples visible over the trees, small towns with names like Sauquois and Frankfort and Norwich Corners, most of them just a crossroads with a gas station, a diner, and a whole lot of pine forest in every direction. In the middle of August, it's warm, that thick, humid warmth that settles over the Northeast in late summer when the cicadas are loud and the road tar goes soft. Everything smells like grass. Everything feels safe. Sarah Ann Wood was 12 years old, curly brown hair, blue eyes, freckles across her nose, the daughter of a local pastor and a homemaker, the youngest of 3 kids. Bright, chatty, a little bit of a firecracker, according to her older brother. Deeply religious, and a huge Dolly Parton fan, which is a detail I love because it locates her in her family and her time so exactly. A 12-year-old girl in a Christian household in rural New York in 1993, humming Jolene to herself. That afternoon, Sarah had gone to vacation Bible school at her father's church. It was the kind of summer activity that defined childhood in that community. A couple of hours in the church basement, songs, crafts, coloring books. When it ended, she got on her bike to ride home. Home was less than half a mile away, down a quiet country road called Hacadam Road, up a steep hill, around a bend, front porch. Done. She had made this ride, or something like it, hundreds of times. She had her coloring book with her crayons, a little bike helmet. The whole scene reads like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. A pastor's daughter on a bike coming home from Bible school on a summer afternoon in America. She should have been home in 5 minutes. Sarah's mother, Frances, started looking at the clock at some point after 2:30, then again at 3, then again at 3:15. There is a specific rhythm to that kind of waiting. You tell yourself, she stopped at a friend's. You tell yourself, she took the long way. You tell yourself she's fine, she's fine, she's fine, until you can't tell yourself that anymore. By 3:30, her brother Dusty was on his own bike riding the route in reverse. Church, road, hill, home, nothing, nobody. The family called the police, and then a neighbor made the phone call that changed the case from missing to taken. Somebody, out searching the shoulder of Hackadam Road, spotted something off the pavement, down a steep embankment, tucked into thick brush at the base, a bike, Sarah's bike, her little coloring book on the ground next to it, some of the crayons scattered in the dirt, nothing else, no blood, no fabric, no tire marks on the road, no skid marks, no sign of a chase. The bike was not on the shoulder. The bike was hidden. That was the moment the whole town realized what had actually happened. Rural upstate New York does not mess around when a child goes missing. Within 24 hours, hundreds of state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and civilian volunteers were combing every square inch of the woods around Sauquoit. Aircraft from the nearby Air Force Base were up. Search dogs were working the road. The whole area was crawling. Because Robert Wood was a pastor, church networks across the state mobilized. Because Sarah was 12 and freckled and photogenic, the story exploded into national news. Someone had the idea to tie teal ribbons around trees. Teal was Sarah's favorite color, and within weeks, teal ribbons were showing up on trees in every state in the country. On flagpoles, on front doors, on lapels. None of it produced a suspect. Not one credible sighting. Not one witness who saw a strange vehicle. Not one driver who remembered passing a man with a 12-year-old girl. The stretch of road she vanished from was 100 yards long, in broad daylight, on a summer afternoon. And there was nothing. Which brings us to the terrifying question. The one investigators were asking each other in the parking lot at the Search Command Center at 4 in the morning. How exactly does this crime happen? Let's stop and really look at that bike. There is a version of this case where a driver, distracted, comes around the bend on Hackadam Road, doesn't see a kid on a bike, and hits her. It's a nightmare, but it's a known nightmare. You know what that scene looks like. Bike bent, kid on the shoulder, driver either stops or panics and speeds off. If they panic and speed off, the bike stays on the road. The bike stays where the impact was. You don't have time to move a bike. You don't have the emotional bandwidth to move a bike. You get out, you look at what you did, and you either call 911 or you drive. You do not carefully carry a bicycle down a steep embankment and hide it in the brush. Which means whoever picked Sarah up off that road did not do it by accident. He had the time. He had the presence of mind. He was calm. This was not a hit and run. This was an abduction. And the person who did it thought clearly enough, in the middle of taking a child off a public road, to remove the physical evidence that would tell the family what had happened. That is a very specific kind of predator. That is somebody who has thought about this before. The other logic gap. Broad daylight, a country road, sure, but not a private one. Cars use that road. There were farmhouses within earshot, and there was zero physical struggle at the scene. No dropped shoe, no torn clothing. No sign Sarah had fought or tried to run, which means one of two things. Either the abductor took her at knife point or gunpoint before she had a chance to make noise, or Sarah knew the person, or thought she did, well enough to get near his vehicle without alarm bells. A voice from a car window, somebody who looked official, somebody who claimed her mother had sent them. The predator was fast. The predator was quiet. And the predator had, almost certainly, done this before. Which meant the police had a very ugly working theory. Whoever took Sarah wasn't done. Whoever took Sarah was going to do it again. Nothing broke in the case for the rest of 1993. Nothing broke in the first months of 1994. Then, in January of 1994, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, about 150 miles east of Sauquoit, a 12-year-old girl named Rebecca Savarez was walking to school. A man in a pickup truck pulled up. She sensed something wrong immediately. He came at her fast with a gun, trying to force her into the truck. She had learned in school, genuinely in a classroom self-defense unit, that if a stranger grabs you, go limp. Fake a medical episode, make yourself dead weight. She did exactly that. She dropped. She said she was having an asthma attack. He struggled to drag her by her backpack toward his vehicle. She slipped her arms out of the straps. She ran. A bystander watching this whole thing unfold got the license plate. Police had the guy in custody within hours. His name was Louis Lent Jr. He worked as a janitor at a local movie theater, middle-aged, quiet, the kind of person nobody would look at twice. And when Massachusetts investigators went to search his home in North Adams, they found something that turned their stomachs. In the basement in progress was a partition of wooden walls. He was in the middle of building something. When they asked him what it was, he told them, without much hedging, that he was constructing a hidden room, a place intended for future victims. Future. New York investigators drove to Massachusetts to talk to him, and in the course of a long, terrible interrogation, Louis Lent Jr. gave them details about Sarah Ann Wood's bicycle that had never been released to the public. He knew the chain had been broken. He knew the frame was slightly too large for her. Details you couldn't guess. Details only somebody who had seen that bike up close on August 18, 1993, would know. By 1996, he'd pleaded guilty to Sarah's murder, and also to the 1990 murder of a 12-year-old boy named James Bernardo, whom he had lured out of the same Pittsfield movie theater where he worked, with $5. Lent confessed to abducting Sarah at knife point, loading her into his van, driving her north into the vast wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains, somewhere near Riquet Lake. He hand-drew maps for investigators. He described a shallow grave in the woods. Here is the part where a normal true crime story ends with closure. This one doesn't. Investigators took Lent's maps. They mobilized what became one of the largest evidence recovery efforts in the state's history. Over 100 personnel, more than 50 days of digging, teams working in deep Adirondack snow, working through terrain that swallows people whole, even without a killer trying to hide a body. They dug, they probed, they combed. They found nothing. Lent then did what men like him do at the very end. He recanted, said his maps were wrong, said he didn't remember, kept for himself the last piece of information he had, the one that would have given the Wood family the ability to bury their daughter. He kept it. He is still keeping it from a prison cell decades later. Sarah Ann Wood is, in the technical language of the law, still a missing person. Her murderer has been convicted. Her killer's identity is not a mystery. But the Adirondack Mountains covered her up, and the man who put her there won't tell. There is a real, hard cruelty to that. Not the cruelty of the crime. That's a different, bigger horror. This is a slower cruelty. A control from the cell cruelty. And the Wood family has lived under it since 1996. What they did with it, though, is what people who love their children do. Sarah's family turned their grief into work. They founded the Sarah Ann Wood Rescue Center, which became a lifeline for missing child cases across upstate New York. They pushed for changes in how the state handled abductions, response times, information sharing, community mobilization. Every Amber Alert adjacent structure in that part of the country has a little bit of Sarah in it. She rode her bike home from Bible school on a warm afternoon in August. She didn't make it, but because of her and because of her family, other kids did. Her bike is not still in the brush. Her killer is not still on the road. But somewhere out there, in the tall pines north of Riquet Lake, a pastor's daughter is still waiting to come home. She is still missed. She is still missed. Imagine your 7-year-old daughter's bedroom window looks out at a quiet suburban street. 2-story houses, trimmed lawns, kids' bikes on the driveway. Somebody's dad is grilling. Somebody's mom is unloading groceries. It's the kind of American neighborhood you drive through and think, yeah, this is what I want for my kids. Now imagine that directly across the street from your daughter's window, 30, 40 feet of asphalt away, is a house that contains 3 convicted sex offenders. Not 1. 3. Living together under one roof in your neighborhood on your street, and imagine that your local police know they're there, and that the FBI knows they're there, and that the parole system knows they're there, and by law they are not allowed to tell you. That was the situation exactly, on Barbara Lee Drive in the summer of 1994. And on a warm Friday evening in July, it produced the exact outcome you would predict. This is the case of Megan Kanka, and it changed the way America handles this problem forever. Hamilton Township, New Jersey. July 29, 1994. Barbara Lee Drive was, by every measurable definition, a good street. Middle class, densely populated, families with young kids on both sides, everybody knew everybody. The kind of block where a mom yelling her daughter's name from the porch would be heard by every other mom on the street, and any one of them would poke a head out to help find the kid. Real community. Not the invented, wishful kind, the actual kind, where people watched each other's children as a matter of course, because that's what neighbors did. It was late July, warm, summer break, the kind of Friday afternoon where the day still feels like it has hours in it, even at 6 p.m. Sprinklers running, ice cream truck making its rounds, a neighborhood that felt, right down in the bones, absolutely safe. At 32, Barbara Lee Drive lived the Kanka family, Maureen and Richard, 3 kids, and in the middle of them, 7-year-old Megan Nicole, first grader, bright, chatty, deeply loved, blonde, cherubic, the kind of little kid who would smile at strangers and mean it. The Kankas had built exactly the life you're supposed to build. The safe street, the good schools, the friendly neighbors, the front yard full of kid noise until the streetlights came on. That evening, Maureen was tired. She had lain down on the couch for a quick nap around 6:30. Megan was outside, which, on Barbara Lee Drive on a July evening in 1994, was just what kids did. At some point during that nap, Megan walked diagonally across the street to a friend's house to play. She didn't take her bike. She didn't take a coat. She walked in the light of a summer evening, 40 feet of asphalt, and she didn't come back. Maureen woke up. The house was quiet. Megan wasn't in her room, wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't in the yard. That specific temperature drop I've talked about in other episodes, that's what hit next. Maureen went to the friend's house. Megan wasn't there, never had been. Nobody had seen her that evening. The friend didn't even know Megan had been on her way over. The Kankas started walking the street, knocking on doors. "Have you seen Megan? Was she at your house? Did she come by?" House after house. No, no, no. By the time the sun started going down, the neighborhood was on the move. Everybody was looking. Everybody's flashlights were out. Everybody's kids were being pulled back inside just in case. Police arrived. Officer Paul Seitz began doing exactly what a good officer does, going door to door, ruling out neighbors one by one. He got to a house across the street from the Kankas. Number 27. 3 grown men lived there together. One of them, a slight, quiet guy named Jesse Timendekis, answered the door. Timendekis said he'd seen Megan earlier, or maybe he hadn't. His story shifted a little between one telling and the next. First, he said she'd been over admiring a boat in the driveway. Then, he said he'd seen her riding her bike between 5:30 and 6. Then, he sort of walked that back. Little inconsistencies, nothing dramatic, but an experienced officer picks up on wobble like that. Meanwhile, police were assuming what everybody assumes when a child vanishes from a good street. A stranger, a drifter, a guy in a van who had passed through and grabbed her in a moment. The bloodhounds were out. Helicopter searches were being organized. The theory was working outward from Barbara Lee Drive to the wider county, the wider state, the wider country. But the answer wasn't a stranger. The answer was already inside the neighborhood. It had been for months. Let's stop and look at Jesse Timendekis. When investigators pulled his record, which they did fast because his story was already wobbling, what came back was long. He had multiple prior convictions for severe crimes against young children. He had served his time at the Adult Diagnostic and Treatment Center in Avenel, New Jersey, a specialized facility that housed sex offenders and attempted to treat them. He'd been released on parole, and he had moved into 27 Barbara Lee Drive. Now hold on a second, because it gets worse than a single offender story. His 2 roommates, the 2 guys he shared that house with, were also convicted sex offenders. All 3 of them had met inside the Avenel facility. All 3 had served sentences for severe offenses against minors. When they got out, they pooled their money, rented a house, and moved into a middle-class family neighborhood. A neighborhood where at least a dozen elementary school-aged kids lived within a block. In front of a school bus stop, 3 known predators, 1 roof. Directly across the street from Megan Conca, the local police department, the state parole board, and the judicial system all knew this. All of it. It was documented. It was on file. It was, on paper, a completely predictable arrangement. 3 men who had met in an offender treatment program had moved in together. And here is the logic gap that broke the country's brain when it eventually came out. Nobody on Barbara Lee Drive knew. Not the Concas, not the neighbors on either side, not the parents of the kids at the bus stop. Nobody. Because at the time, in 1994, sex offender registries, where they existed at all, were confidential to law enforcement. It was against the law for local police to knock on doors and warn parents that 3 convicted predators had moved onto their street. Read that sentence again. It was, in 1994, illegal for the police to tell the Concas. The privacy of the men in that house was, by statute, more protected than the safety of the 7-year-old across the street. That's the whole case. That's the fulcrum. Every other detail of what happened to Megan Conca bends around that one legal fact. By early morning on July 30th, just hours after the disappearance, police had enough weirdness in Timendekwis's answers to get consent to search his home. They walked through. Nothing obvious, but they noticed heavy blankets being washed in the machine. In July. On a hot night, investigators asked him to come in for further questioning. He was, by every report, sweating profusely, shaking. The officers running the interrogation could see something was about to break. And in one of the more surreal turns in the whole case, Timendekwis asked to speak with one of his housemates, Brian Jenin, before he'd say anything more. Jenin was brought into the room. What he said to Timendekwis is, on the record, this: "They got you. They got you. They got you. You're going to need a friend on the outside, and I'll be that friend." That was the moment. Timendekwis heard his own roommate, a fellow convicted offender, say out loud that this was over. He dropped his head, and he said, "She's in Mercer County Park." Then, over the next several hours, he told them the rest. He had lured Megan into his house with the story of a new puppy. "Come see him. Come pet him. He's just inside." She had followed him in. She had, when he attacked her, fought back, bit him hard enough on the hand that dental records later matched the bite. He had panicked and took her life. He wrapped her body up and drove it to Mercer County Park, a wooded county park a short drive away, and dumped her near a portable toilet. Investigators recovered Megan's body within hours of the confession. She'd been gone for less than a day. Here is where this case leaves the crime and becomes a piece of American history. When the details came out, the 3 offenders under one roof, the police who had known and been legally forbidden to tell, the front porch where a convicted predator had been watching a 7-year-old play in her yard, the response was volcanic. Not just from the Concas, from the whole country. Because every parent in America looked at their own quiet street and asked the same question, the question you can hear echoing through this entire case. Why didn't anyone tell us? And the answer, because it was against the law to tell you, was politically radioactive. Maureen and Richard Conca did not disappear into private grief. They took a phone book and started calling politicians. They collected signatures. Within 89 days of Megan's death, New Jersey passed the first version of a public sex offender notification law. Within 2 years, in 1996, Congress passed the federal version. It was called, and is still called, Megan's Law. It required states to notify communities about the presence of registered sex offenders. It required registries to be, in one form or another, accessible to the public. Whatever you think of the law now, and 20-plus years in, there's genuinely complicated debate about how it's applied, how effective it is, and whether it prevents the crimes it was designed to prevent. The basic principle that came out of this case is one every parent understands in their gut. If somebody who has been convicted of hurting a child moves onto your block, you get to know. Jesse Timendekwis was convicted of capital murder in 1997. He was sentenced to death. When New Jersey abolished capital punishment in 2007, that sentence was commuted to life without parole. He is still in prison. He always will be. The Conca family kept the small pink house on Barbara Lee Drive for a while, and then eventually they left it. They couldn't keep looking at the house across the street. Megan didn't come home that summer evening. She walked 40 feet of asphalt to see a friend, and she didn't make it. But what her parents built, in the ash of that impossible loss, changed the way every state in America handles the exact situation that killed her. Number 27 was across the street from the Conkas. Now the whole street knows, and the whole street in every town in this country gets to know. That's her. That's what she left. There is a version of this country where a 14-year-old goes missing and the entire nation stops. Helicopters go up. Cable news anchors say her name. Volunteers by the 1,000 walk fields for a photograph they've seen for a week. That happens sometimes. It didn't happen for the girl in this story. When Amber Creek walked out of a youth home in Palatine, Illinois on a freezing January night in 1997, nobody sent a helicopter. Nobody put her on the evening news. Her caseworkers logged it, her file got flagged, and life on the outside continued exactly as it had before. She was a runaway. She had run before. Everybody assumed she'd come back. When her body was found 17 days later in a wildlife area across state lines in Wisconsin, nobody made the connection. Not for 16 months. She lay in a morgue with no name. And on her body, the killer had left a detail so casually cruel that when you hear it, you'll wish you hadn't. This is the case of Amber Creek. Palatine, Illinois, January 1997. Let me set the vibe, because it matters. The Chicago suburbs in the dead of January are a specific kind of miserable. Snow that's been on the ground long enough to turn gray, wind cutting off the lake, the sun down by 4:30. Everything is fluorescent lit, gas stations, diners, the cheap motels off the interstate, that specific institutional feeling of a Midwest winter where every parking lot looks the same and everybody's just trying to make it to spring. Amber Creek was 14 years old. She was a ward of the state. She had been living in a youth home in the Chicago area, one of those places the system sends kids who have run out of other options. She had been through more before the age of 14 than most adults will experience in a lifetime. She was, by every account of the social workers who tried to help her, fiercely independent, sharp, and unwilling to disappear into the machinery, which is another way of saying she ran a lot. That's the piece of this case I want you to hold on to, because it's the piece that makes everything else that happens make sense. When a middle-class kid vanishes on her way home from a slumber party, this country mobilizes. When a ward of the state, a habitual runaway, a girl the system has already given up on protecting, walks out of a youth home in the middle of January, this country files a report and moves on. That's not editorializing. That's just how the machine worked in 1997, and honestly, it's how a lot of the machine still works. Amber went to a party, a motel party in Rolling Meadows, just outside the city, the kind of chaotic, unsupervised gathering that 14-year-olds with nowhere safe to go find their way to. She was doing what a lot of teenagers in her exact situation did, trying to find some warmth, some community, some sense of not being invisible. At some point that night, she left the party, alone, into the freezing dark, trying to catch a ride somewhere. She didn't come back. 17 days later, early February 1997, a group of hunters were walking through the Karcher Wildlife Area near Burlington, Wisconsin. This is a remote, brutal in winter piece of land. Wetlands, marsh, thick brush, deep snow. The kind of place you go if you don't want anybody to find what you've left. The hunters found what somebody had left. It was the body of a young girl. She had been dumped, not buried. She was partially covered by the snow that had fallen after she'd been placed there. She was found tragically murdered, and the scene indicated she had been the victim of a brutal assault before her life was taken. She had been dead for weeks. Racine County Sheriff's deputies responded. A crime scene team worked the area in freezing wind, and in that first walkthrough, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. There was a small piece of paper on her body, a retail price tag. Just a tag. The little paper kind you'd peel off a shirt from a discount store. Left there. Not obviously fallen off her clothes. Not obviously part of any garment she was wearing. Just present. Now let's stop and sit with that for a second. Because I want you to feel how bizarre it is. If you've killed somebody, and you've bothered to drive that person into a remote wildlife area across a state line to dispose of them, and you've taken the time to conceal her body before abandoning it, You have thought about this. You're being careful. You're being deliberate. Everything you're doing has intent behind it. So what is the price tag doing there? Was it an accident? Some cheap piece of merchandise the killer had touched and inadvertently transferred to her body? Possible. A small, dumb piece of forensic garbage the offender didn't notice? Possible. Or was it something else? Was it a message, a signature? A killer viewing the girl in front of him as something purchased, used, discarded, the way you'd toss the tag from a shirt into the trash after you're done with it? A statement about how disposable he thought she was? There is no version of that answer that isn't horrible. Investigators tried to hold on to the possibility that it was an innocent accident, but nothing else about the scene suggested carelessness. Everything else was deliberate. They photographed everything. They preserved everything. They took the physical evidence left at the scene, sealed it, and prepared to send it to a lab. And then they turned to the harder problem. Who was she? Here is where the case runs headfirst into the wall. Racine County, the Wisconsin county where the body was found, did the standard thing. Fingerprints, dental records, descriptions. They put a Jane Doe file into every state and regional database they had access to. They circulated a physical description. They kept working. Meanwhile, in Palatine, Illinois, a state away, social workers had a runaway file for a 14-year-old girl named Amber Creek. That file, too, went into a database, a missing person file. Neither database talked to the other. Now let's stop, because this is one of those logic gaps that will make you want to throw your remote. This is the mid-90s. State-level law enforcement systems in this country were essentially siloed. Missing person data lived in one system. Unidentified remains data lived in another. Different jurisdictions used different software. A Jane Doe in Wisconsin and a runaway teenager in Illinois could sit in two separate government computers at the same time for months with the exact same physical description, and no algorithm anywhere would draw the line between them. Because there was no algorithm, because nobody had built one yet. So Amber Creek was missing, and a Jane Doe was in a Wisconsin morgue, and it took 16 months for anyone to connect the two. 16 months. Think about what that means, day by day. Racine County investigators are working a homicide with no victim ID. They can't tell her family. They can't build a timeline. They can't know where she was seen last, who she was with, what her circle looked like. Meanwhile, in Illinois, Amber's caseworkers are wondering when she'll turn up again, because she always turned up again, until she didn't. The break didn't come from a database. It came from a facial reconstruction, a forensic artist's clay and guess rendering of what the Jane Doe might have looked like alive, that got broadcast on a national television program. A social worker who had known Amber saw it, called it in. And in 1998, more than a year after her body was found, the girl in the Karcher wildlife area finally had a name. But the killer didn't. And for a very long time, it looked like he never would. 16 years passed. The 90s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The case went cold in the way these cases do. Files got boxed, detectives retired, new detectives took over, Amber's name stayed on a list, one of thousands of unsolved homicides in the Midwest. And every anniversary, someone in the department would look at her file again and try to think of an angle they hadn't tried. The one thing that never went away was the plastic bag. That plastic bag, the one the killer had used to conceal her, sat in an evidence locker in Racine County the whole time, preserved, sealed, waiting. In 2014, fingerprint identification technology had changed. The national systems, the databases that store latent prints across jurisdictions and agencies, had been upgraded, digitized, and cross-linked in ways that in 1997 were literally impossible. Detectives took another look at the physical evidence in Amber's case. They resubmitted the fingerprints that had been lifted decades earlier from that plastic bag. The system came back with a hit. His name was James Eaton. He was 36 years old. He was living a completely quiet, unremarkable life. He was from Palatine, Illinois, the same town Amber had come from, which meant, terrifyingly, that at the time of the murder in 1997, he had been just 19 years old. He'd been a teenager himself when he killed her. To confirm the match before making an arrest, investigators followed Eaton one afternoon. They tailed him to a Chicago area commuter train station. They watched him finish a cigarette. They watched him toss the butt. They picked it up. They ran the DNA on that discarded cigarette against biological evidence preserved from the scene. They got the confirmation they were looking for. He was arrested. He pleaded no contest to first-degree reckless homicide. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Here's the thing about Amber Creek that stays with me. She was a girl the world had decided, before she was even born, was disposable. She was placed in the system. She was moved through it. She was the kind of kid who slipped between adults, between agencies, between databases. And when she was killed, the exact system that had failed to protect her ensured she remained a Jane Doe for a year and a half. Even in death, she had trouble getting anyone to know her name. And a killer, a 19-year-old, quietly living a normal life for the next 17 years, got to walk around believing he'd chosen the right kind of victim. A kid nobody would look for hard enough. A kid the news wouldn't stop for. A kid whose case would go cold and stay cold, forever, because that's what happened to girls like Amber. He wasn't wrong for a very long time. He was wrong in the end. Because a fingerprint on a plastic bag sealed in an evidence locker in a Racine County storage room waited for the technology to catch up. And when it did, that fingerprint said what nobody in 1997 had been in a position to say. It said, she was here. He was here. Somebody remembers. The system that failed Amber Creek in life, eventually, barely, imperfectly, 17 years too late, did one thing for her in death. It refused to let her stay nameless. It refused to let him stay free. She was a runaway. She was a Jane Doe. She was 14 years old. Her name is Amber. Say it out loud. That's the last thing the machine couldn't take from her. A 15-year-old cheerleader, alone in the middle of the night, in a rural cemetery she had never been to before. She had just escaped from a car driven by a man twice her age who had already held her captive in unimaginable terror for 6 hours. She was barefoot in some accounts. She was running blind in the pitch dark. She had no idea where she was, no idea which way home was, no idea if there was another road, another car, another human being for miles. And she outran him. For long enough, for far enough, long enough to hide behind a gravestone, far enough that we can still see, 20 feet away on the far side of the cemetery, the deep impression her knee made in the mud as she pressed herself down and prayed to a God she was raised to believe in that he would keep going past her in the dark. He didn't. He caught her at a fence, and what he did to her there, a 15-year-old cheerleader who had made honor roll, who wore her boyfriend's pendant around her neck, who had almost made it, took investigators 17 years to solve. This is the case of Jessica Keene. Columbus, Ohio, March 15th, 1991. If you've never been to Columbus in mid-March, imagine damp cold that's worse than dry cold. Gray sky, gray slush at the curbs, everybody wearing a jacket they're already tired of. That specific late winter Midwest feeling where spring is supposedly coming but hasn't shown up yet. Jessica Lynn Keene was 15. Bright, warm, funny, the kind of kid teachers actually enjoy having in class. She'd been an honor roll student and a cheerleader at Westland High School, the classic combination that in a town like Columbus makes you the pride of your parents and the friend of everybody's mom. She had also, in the way 15-year-olds do, fallen hard for a boy her mother didn't approve of. His name was Sean Thompson. He was 18. He was a high school dropout. He was, in Jessica's mom's view, exactly the wrong kind of person for her daughter to be sneaking around with. And Jessica had started slipping. Grades down, skipping school. The relationship had swallowed her whole. Her mom, at her wit's end and doing what she thought was right, had signed Jessica into a place called the Huckleberry House, a temporary residential counseling center for kids who were going off the rails. Not a punishment, a timeout, a place with adults and structure, and a chance to reset. That afternoon, Jessica walked out of the Huckleberry House and stood at a bus stop, planning to catch a ride to a nearby mall, which was, on paper, an approved outing. What was less approved was that she was going to secretly meet Sean there. Because they were 15 and 18, and that's what 15 and 18 do. She never made it to the mall. Sean waited. Jessica never showed. By that night, her family was frantic. She wasn't home. She wasn't at Sean's. She wasn't at any friend's house. She had been standing at a bus stop in a busy part of Columbus in daylight, and somewhere between that bus stop and the mall, she had disappeared into the space between one moment and the next. 2 days later, someone found her. Not in Columbus. 20 miles west of the city, in a rural area near a town called West Jefferson, in a small, isolated country graveyard called the Foster Chapel Cemetery. Middle of farmland, middle of nowhere, miles from any address Jessica had ever had reason to be at. And the scene the crime scene technicians walked into that afternoon told them almost the entire story of Jessica's last hour on Earth. She had, according to what they could piece together from the ground, escaped her killer's vehicle somewhere near the cemetery entrance. She had run. There were shoe prints in disturbed earth that told the direction. She had gone through the cemetery, through the gravestones, in the dark, moving away from the road, toward the only light she could see, which was a distant farmhouse on the far side of the field. Behind one of the gravestones, deep in the mud, was a knee impression. She had hidden. She had pressed herself against the back of a headstone and stayed as still as she could and waited for him to walk past. Nearby on the ground were a pair of her socks. She had shed them at some point during the chase, probably to run faster, probably to be quieter. She kept going. She made it most of the way to the far fence. She was running for the farmhouse, and she hit a wooden fence rail in the pitch dark, and it knocked her flat, slowed her down, gave her killer the seconds he needed to catch up. What he did next is not something I'm going to describe in graphic terms, because Jessica was 15, and she deserves better than that. What matters for this case is the murder weapon. He didn't use a conventional weapon. In a final act of unimaginable brutality, he used one of the heavy granite headstones from the cemetery itself to take her life. When he was done, he threw the stone over the fence. She was still wearing her rings, still wearing her watch. This was not a robbery. The only thing missing from her body was a small gold pendant, a pendant that Sean Thompson had given her, a pendant with a word engraved on it. Let me set up the two theories that consumed the next 17 years of this case. Theory number 1. Sean Thompson did it. This one had, on the surface, a lot going for it. Jessica had been secretly on her way to meet him. She had recently been institutionally separated from him by her mother. The relationship was volatile, and the one thing missing from the body, a pendant he had personally given her, was a specific, symbolic taunt, as if the killer had reached into her chest, took the boy's gift, and kept it. Rage crime, jealousy crime, boyfriend crime. Case closed in most detectives' minds. Theory number 2. Local teenage boys did it as a group. This one came from a different direction. The murder weapon, the 70-pound tombstone, was, criminologists argued, too heavy for a single attacker to have wielded with enough force to have caused the injuries Jessica sustained, and then subsequently to have hurled the stone entirely over a fence. 2 people, they argued, maybe more. Maybe teenagers on some kind of horrifying dare. Maybe kids who knew her from Westland High. Rumors started, names got whispered. Kids who had absolutely nothing to do with this had their reputations ruined for years by the town they lived in. Now, let's stop and look at both theories through the eyes of somebody trying to be honest. If it was Sean, then a broken-up teenage kid who had been sitting at the mall for hours waiting for a girlfriend who never came, had somehow, in that same window, kidnapped her, held her captive for 6 hours, driven her 20 miles into rural farmland, and killed her in a way that involved deadlifting a granite tombstone. That is a lot for a 19-year-old dropout to have done in one afternoon while being observed at a mall. And if it was a group of local teenagers, well, here's the logic gap. Teenagers talk. Teenagers panic under interrogation. If a group of kids from a Columbus area high school had committed a crime this horrific, at least one of them would have cracked. To a friend, to a parent, to a priest, to a girlfriend, to a cop. That is how group crimes committed by kids get solved. Someone always breaks. Nobody broke. And then early DNA testing came back, and the samples pulled from the crime scene did not match Sean Thompson, and they did not match any of the local boys who had been whispered about. The killer, whoever he was a stranger. He wasn't in Columbus. He wasn't in the friend group. He wasn't at Westland High. He was, in the language of investigators, a phantom. And with that word, phantom, Jessica's case slid into a filing cabinet, and the town of Columbus began 17 years of not knowing. Rumors, though, don't respect DNA evidence. In small-town America in the early 90s, an accusation that never quite got proven and never quite got retracted just sat there in the water like a heavy metal. Sean Thompson lived under the shadow of that suspicion for years. So did other boys named in speculation nobody could stop. The town that Jessica had grown up in, that had loved her, that had grieved her, spent almost 2 decades quietly suspecting the wrong people while the real killer went about his business somewhere else. He was not idle either, because here's what investigators would eventually learn. The man who killed Jessica Keene did not stop after Jessica. He kept doing what he did. In the years after the murder, in the exact same Columbus area, he racked up 2 additional violent convictions for assaults on other women. Which meant, and this is the part that will make you want to break something, his DNA got entered into the Ohio State database. He was, from the mid-90s onward, quietly in the system. He had just never been checked against Jessica's file. Cold case units are a specific kind of dogged. Their job is to keep pulling old files one by one and asking, what can we do now that we couldn't do then? In April 2008, a newly established cold case team in Columbus took Jessica's file down off the shelf. They took the DNA profile from the 1991 crime scene, carefully preserved for 17 years, and they resubmitted it into the Ohio State database, which by 2008 had expanded, digitized, and cross-linked in ways that in 1991 were pure science fiction. The system took about as long as your microwave takes to reheat coffee. Marvin Lee Smith, Jr., 51 years old at the time of the match, which meant he had been in his mid-30s when he killed Jessica. A grown man, not a teenager, not a boyfriend, not somebody from the neighborhood, a stranger. His DNA was in the system for the 2 subsequent assaults he had committed in Columbus after Jessica. Investigators arrested him. Confronted with the DNA evidence he could not talk his way out of, Smith pleaded guilty in 2009 to aggravated murder in order to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. He will die in prison. At his sentencing, he had, in essence, no relationship to Jessica whatsoever. He had never met her. He did not know her name. He had spotted a 15-year-old girl standing alone at a bus stop in Columbus one afternoon in March 1991, and he had made a decision. That is the coldest possible version of this crime. Not passion, not obsession, not a boyfriend gone wrong, not a group of teenagers dared into something monstrous, just a predator on a normal afternoon, seeing an opportunity and taking it. Here's what stays with me about Jessica Keene. She fought. From the moment she was pulled off that bus stop to the moment she died against a wooden fence in a country cemetery, she fought. She hid behind a headstone. She kicked off her socks so she could run faster. She oriented on a distant farmhouse light, and she headed toward it in the pitch dark across unfamiliar ground. The word almost is going to sit with you. She almost made it. 20 more seconds of not tripping on that fence rail, and she might be alive today. Her killer got 17 years of thinking he had gotten away with it. The town got 17 years of suspecting the wrong people. Sean Thompson got 17 years of being looked at sideways by strangers. And Jessica got a lab tech in 2008, resubmitting a preserved sample into a database that hadn't existed in 1991, and finally producing a name for a face nobody had ever seen. She didn't come home from the bus stop. She never got to be 16. She never got to hate her cheerleading photos in her 20s. She never got to graduate from Westland, or apologize to her mom about Sean, or become whoever she was going to become. But she left a knee print in the mud behind a gravestone. She left a pair of socks in a field. She left DNA on the clothes of the man who killed her. She left a fight so ferocious that the crime scene alone told a story investigators could piece together, step by step, in the dark. She almost made it, and in the end, 17 years later, it turned out, she did. Most true crime stories have a monster. There's a villain. There's a victim. There's a survivor who spends the rest of their life running from what happened to them. This one has none of that. In this one, an 8-hour-old baby was carried out of a Jacksonville hospital by a stranger in a floral smock, and for 18 years, nobody in America could find her. And when she was finally found, grown up, healthy, thriving, in a South Carolina town nobody had ever thought to look, she did something that no true crime playbook prepares you for. She stood up in court and defended the woman who took her. She still called her mom. She still loved her, and she meant it. This is the case of Camilla Mobley. And it doesn't end the way you think it does. Jacksonville, Florida, July 10th, 1998. The University Medical Center on that summer afternoon was doing what big city hospitals do. Loud, bright, fluorescent, nurses moving in every direction, rolling carts, beeping monitors, family members clutching flower bouquets and looking for the right room number. The maternity floor especially had that particular chaotic joy of a place where 100 lives were beginning at once. If you had to design the safest building in America, you would draw a maternity ward. You'd have shift-rotating medical staff, security cameras, nurse stations at every corner, wristband matching between mother and baby, locked doors. It's supposed to be the closest thing to a fortress an ordinary family will ever walk into. That was the whole point of the environment, and in the middle of it all, on that particular Friday, in a hospital bed on the maternity floor, was a 16-year-old girl named Shannara Mobley. She had just given birth to her first child. A girl, Camilla, 8 hours old. I want you to sit with the vulnerability of that setup for a second. 16 years old, first pregnancy, exhausted from labor, overwhelmed with love, in a strange room with strange machines and strange people walking in and out constantly. Everyone she met that day was a stranger in scrubs. Every single one of them looked like they belonged there, because they all did. Except one of them didn't. She walked in wearing a floral hospital smock over her scrubs. Warm smile. Older woman, motherly energy. She didn't rush. She didn't make Shannara feel small or dumb the way exhausted new mothers often get made to feel. She sat down. She talked. She asked how Shannara was doing. She admired the baby. She asked to hold her. And Shannara, 16, in a hospital, being addressed by someone in a smock who acted like a nurse, did what any of us would do. She said yes. Now, hold on a second. Let's look at that scene from 30,000 feet. Because this next part is what makes this whole case so different from every other abduction case you've ever heard about. This woman didn't just breeze in, grab a baby, and run. She stayed. For hours. She sat in that hospital room and built a relationship with a teenage mother. She talked, she listened, she held the baby, put her back down, held her again. She wandered the halls between visits. She said hi to other new moms. She stood at the nursery window. She got coffee. She was there for something like 14 hours. 14 hours, roaming a busy hospital in a smock. And not one nurse, one doctor, one janitor, one security guard, one shift change supervisor stopped to ask her who she was. Eventually, in the evening, she came back into Shannara's room with a professional-sounding concern. She said Camilla felt a little warm to her, might have a low-grade fever. Nothing serious, but she'd take her to the nursery to have someone look at her, just to be safe. Shannara said, "Okay." The woman scooped up Camilla in a blanket, walked out of the room, walked down the corridor, walked past the nurse's station, walked to the elevator, walked out the front doors of the hospital. And she was gone. Some indeterminate amount of time later, and every version of this story is a little heartbreaking about how long, a real nurse came in to check on Shannara, made small talk. Then, casually, "Where's the baby?" There's a specific temperature that the human body drops to when a mother realizes her newborn is missing. That's the temperature Shannara Mobley hit at that moment. The hospital exploded into motion. Every door was locked. Security was on the phone with police in minutes. The FBI was called. Every car leaving the parking lot was stopped and searched. Helicopters went up, roadblocks. Every hospital employee who worked a shift that day was interviewed. And they hit the tapes. Which brings us to the first devastating gut punch of the investigation. The nursery camera was broken. Not the tape was damaged. Not the angle was bad. The nursery security camera was, and had been, out of service. There was no footage of the woman in the smock at the point where it would have mattered most. What they had was some grainy, low-resolution shots from hallway cameras. A blurry woman, a smock, a general shape. Nothing you could put on a poster and expect a recognition. Nothing you could feed into any 1998-era facial software and get a hit. The best evidence law enforcement had was Shannara's memory. And Shannara had just been through 14 hours of labor. She'd spent all day looking at a friendly face, but friendly face is not a lineup. A composite sketch went out. It was essentially a shrug in pencil form. The suspect vanished into a city of 1 million people, and then into a country of 300 million. Let's stop and look at the logic of this crime, because it doesn't add up. For a baby to disappear from a maternity ward and stay disappeared, every layer of security has to fail simultaneously. Real nurses have to not notice a fake nurse loitering for 14 hours. Front desk staff have to not question a woman walking out the front door with a newborn in a blanket. Cameras that are supposed to be recording the nursery have to be broken on the exact day it matters. And once the abductor is out in the parking lot, she has to have a plan, a car, a destination, a story ready for anyone who might ask her whose baby that is. You don't do all that on a whim, which is why investigators, from day one, believed one of two things. Either this was a highly organized black market baby ring, the kind of thing that supposedly sells infants to buyers overseas, or it was one very, very disturbed individual who had spent a long time preparing. Neither theory produced a suspect. Weeks became months. Months became years. Over the following decade and a half, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office chased more than 2,500 tips. They aged Camilla's face on posters, 1-year-old, 5, 10, 14. They ran the sketch of the woman in the smock on national TV. Nothing ever stuck. Shannara sued the hospital and won a multi-million-dollar settlement, which some people saw as closure. It wasn't. It was money that lived in a bank account while a mother had nothing else to do with it. Every year, on July 10th, Shannara Mobley cut a birthday cake for a daughter she couldn't find. That happened for 18 straight years. Somewhere out there, somebody was raising Camilla, and the world had no idea where. Now we jump. 2017, South Carolina. Small city called Walterboro, about an hour outside Charleston. An 18-year-old girl named Alexis Manigo is doing the most ordinary thing an 18-year-old does. She's trying to get her first real job. And to get the job, she needs a social security card. She asks her mom for it, and her mom, Gloria Williams, breaks. This is one of those moments in a case where you'd give anything to have been in the room. Gloria sits her daughter down and tells her, in some version of the truth, that the paperwork isn't real, that Alexis's birth certificate isn't hers, that she was never born as Alexis Manigo, that there is a name and a face and a hospital and a city Alexis has never heard of, and that 18 years ago, in a maternity ward in Jacksonville, Florida, Gloria did something she's been running from for the entire life of the daughter sitting in front of her. Now think about what that afternoon feels like. Alexis has a childhood. She has a mom she loves. She has family vacations, prom photos, favorite meals, birthdays, arguments about curfew, a life, a whole real, warm, unremarkable American life. And her mother has just told her that none of it was supposed to be hers. And here's the strangest little wrinkle in this whole case. Alexis apparently, at some level, already suspected. She had, more than a year earlier, told a friend that she sometimes wondered if she had been kidnapped from a hospital. That intuition, where it came from, whether she had overheard something, whether it was pure static, had been sitting inside her for a long time. Tips flowed to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Detectives from Jacksonville drove up to Walterboro. They asked for a DNA swab. They got one. The lab did the math. Alexis Manigo was Camilla Mobley. Gloria Williams was arrested, and investigators finally learned her motive. She had recently suffered a devastating miscarriage in the months before July 1998. She was, by every account, in the grip of severe postpartum depression at the time. She drove across state lines to a random hospital, put on a smock, spent a day acting the part, and left with somebody else's daughter to fill a hole she couldn't fill any other way. No trafficking ring, no conspiracy, one woman in profound grief, doing something no one is legally allowed to do. Here is where this story stops behaving like a true crime story. Camilla, or Alexis, depending on which name you use, and she uses both, did not spend her recovery hating the woman who took her. She did the opposite. In court, she wept for Gloria Williams. She defended her. She called her mom in front of a judge who was about to sentence her to 18 years in prison. She told Shannara, her biological mother, the woman who had cut 18 birthday cakes for her, that she loved her, but she also loved the woman on trial. Both things were true. Both things were going to stay true. The tabloid version of this story would want a monster. There isn't one clean one. Gloria Williams committed a serious crime. She also raised a happy, healthy young woman who by every measurable outcome had a good childhood. Shannara Mobley was a victim. She was also forever the mother of a daughter who was raised by somebody else. Camilla is a kidnapped child. She is also just a woman with two mothers, trying to make sense of a life that was authored by grief long before she was old enough to have an opinion about it. The mystery got solved. The math got done. The paperwork got refiled. But there is no version of this case that ends with anyone getting back what they lost. Shannara lost 18 birthdays. Gloria lost her freedom. And Camilla, in the end, lost the one thing you don't get to keep in a story like this: the ability to be sure who her family really is. She still calls Gloria Mom. And whatever we think about that from the outside, she gets to.